As such was impossible, it is evident that the whole matter from the time of his capture in the garden to his being nailed to the cross at the third hour, and being on the cross at the sixth hour, had to not only be longer than 12 hours, but also had to be more than 24 hours, more than one full day. Consider also the actual time involved in the events which transpired after the sunrise following Christ's capture in the garden, and his pre-sunrise trials before some of the Jewish leaders. These times are the time for convening and conducting the trial before the, quote, whole council, end quote, after sunrise, and reaching the determination to send Christ to Pilate, the time it took in sending him to Pilate, the time for convening the hearing before Pilate, the time involved in the first hearing before Pilate, wherein he heard the many accusations against Christ, and had learned that he was from Galilee, and thus in Herod's jurisdiction, the time it took to send him to Herod, the time to convene and conduct the hearing before Herod, wherein Herod, quote, questioned with him in many words, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him, end quote, the time for Herod's, quote, men of war, end quote, to set him at naught and mock him and array him in a gorgeous robe, the time it took to send him back to Pilate, the time it took for Pilate to call together, quote, the chief priests and the rulers and the people, end quote, after Jesus was returned to him, the time for Pilate to re-examine him, the time to have Barabbas brought forth from prison and to present Jesus and him before the people for them to make a choice, the time to scourge him again, the time to carry the cross from Pilate's judgment hall to the place of crucifixion outside of the city. The popular tradition says that all of those events occurred between sunrise on the 15th and the third hour of the same morning, a period of 3 hours. Yet considering that those conducting the trials themselves all had to maintain a certain decorum, and that the trials could not be quick, short sessions, this is especially true of those before the Romans, and more so regarding the scourgings by Herod and Pilate. As a man's life was at stake, the Romans were not about to easily let the Jewish leaders dupe them into murdering an innocent man. But when we take into account that John's record has Christ before Pilate, quote, about the 6th hour, end quote, the midnight after the end of the 15th, then the events which transpired before Pilate and Herod would have easily been done before the third hour of the 16th, Friday, the actual day of the crucifixion. Keep in mind that the Romans were not in the same hurry to get rid of Christ as were the Jews. Pilate was eventually actually on his side, had discerned the intent of the Jewish leaders, was not happy about it, Matthew 27:18 and 23, and sought to release him, and that Herod was very curious about Jesus, quote, exceeding glad, end quote, to see him, and asked him, quote, many words, end quote, Luke 23:8 and 9. Thus, with the foregoing in mind, we see that the crucifixion could not have taken place on the 15th, the day of the feast, Thursday, but rather took place on the 16th, Friday. This brings us back to matter of the offering of the wave sheaf, that is, was/is it to be done on the 16th or on Sunday? From the foregoing we have seen that Christ was on the cross on the 16th, Friday. But was that in fulfillment of the offering of the wave sheaf in God's eyes? Some have concluded that since he was, quote, lifted up, end quote, when he was on the cross, as he said he would be, John 3:14 and 15, John 8:28, John 12:32 and 33, that he was thus waved. But the waving of the typical sheaf itself contained a totally different meaning. The purpose in offering the wave sheaf on, quote, the morrow after the Sabbath, end quote, was to indicate the beginning of the harvest, not the end of something. When Christ was about to die, he stated, quote, it is finished, end quote, not it has begun. We read of the wave sheaf offering, quote, ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you, end quote. Leviticus 23, 10 through 11. The Jewish leaders sought to ease their consciences in what they were about to do by saying that Jesus had to die to save the nation. Of this we read, quote, and one of them, the Pharisees, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. End quote. John 11, verse 49 and 50. But the question arises, was Caiaphas saying that with the intention of that, quote, one man, end quote, Christ, being the one which was, quote, to be accepted for you, end quote, as is said of the wave sheaf, seeing that neither he nor the majority of the Pharisees even believed in him, nor in his work, nor in his purpose for being on the earth. It wasn't for the personal salvation from sin for those in Israel or the world that Caiaphas and those with him were planning on killing Jesus, but rather that their own positions would be secure within the Roman Empire. We read, quote, then many of the Jews which came to Mary, and had seen the things which Jesus did, believed on him. But some of them went their ways to the Pharisees, and told them what things Jesus had done. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council, and said, what do we? For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. And the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. End quote. John 11, verses 45 through 48. Therein we see their true purpose, the fear of the Romans, not the fear of God. This is borne out when later, quote, they cried out, away with him, Christ, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. End quote. John 19:15. This we also know from the fact that even though the death and resurrection brought salvation to many in Israel who afterwards believed on Christ, his death meant the end of the Jewish nation within the Roman Empire, when a few decades later Jerusalem was attacked by the Romans and the temple destroyed. So, in applying the fact that, quote, one man should die for the people, end quote, in the way that they did by crucifying Christ themselves, they ended their positions and authority rather than preserving them. Regarding Caiaphas' declaration, quote, that one man should die for the people, end quote, John says, quote, and this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. End quote. John 11, verses 51 and 52. This statement that what Caiaphas said, he said as, quote, high priest, end quote, isolated from its context, would seem to imply that he and the other leaders and priests were knowingly doing right by thinking to crucify Christ. But such is no more the case than was the situation when the rebellious prophet Balaam was hired to curse Israel, but was forced by circumstances to actually bless them. Numbers 22, 5 through 24, verse 9. So, rather than the Jewish leaders' offering of Christ being something which was, quote, to be accepted for you, end quote, it was actually something which was the cause of their rejection, as was the case with Balaam, Numbers 31:8. Thus, Christ's being on the cross on the 16th, being wholly of man's invention, that is, both to time and purpose, was not in fulfillment of the offering of the wave sheaf. they lifted him up on the cross on the day of their wave sheaf offering, while wholly ignoring the Lord's time and purpose for the true wave sheaf offering. If they had let Jesus alone, and all men had the opportunity to believe on him, some others with selfish characters like themselves would have been so offended by Christ's purity and effect on the people that they would have put him to death. But the Jewish leaders were so interested in themselves being first in all things that they did it to him before others had a chance to, though this may not have been in their forethoughts. And this desire to have the preeminence above other men led them to create the idea that the 16th is the correct day, the morrow after the Sabbath, for the wave sheaf offering, and pressing it upon men through their positions, resulting in them putting Christ on the cross on the 16th, the day after the first day of the feast,